This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Iraqi government has resolved a 4-month political stalemate with the appointment of a new prime minister. Shiite leader Jawad Maliki will replace Ibrahim Jaafari. Jaafari stepped down after a lengthy dispute with Sunni and Kurdish leaders who refused to back his leadership. Several analysts say the United States also played a pivotal role in replacing Jaafari. Stephen Simon, a senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, said, quote, "The Iraqi government wouldn't have consented to it if it weren't for the heavy pressure that the United States was bringing to bear." Our guest today is an author who's been tracking the Bush administration's goals in Iraq since the invasion. Antonia Juhasz has written about them in a new book. It's called The Bush Agenda: Invading the World One Economy at a Time. The book tracks the radical neoliberal economic program the Bush administration has tried to impose on Iraq, which threatens to leave Iraq's economy and oil reserves largely in the hands of multinational corporations. It's an agenda, says Antonia Juhasz, that the Bush administration is trying to bring to all corners of the globe. Antonia Juhasz joins us in our Firehouse studio. She's a visiting scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies. For years, she was project director at the International Forum on Globalization. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me, Amy.
And congratulations on this book.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Can you talk about the leadership of Iraq?
Well, I would argue that the most important member of the new leadership is Adel Abdul Mahdi, who has been in every U.S.-appointed Iraqi government post the invasion. He was the finance minister of the interim government, the vice president of the transitional government, and was just named vice president of the permanent government. He was actually the man that the Bush administration wanted to be the new prime minister of Iraq. The deal that was worked out was that another member of the Dawa party, just like Mr. Jaafari, would become prime minister, and then Mahdi, who is a member of the Syri party, would be vice president. It's a position that allows him to continue to be the most aggressive advocate of the Bush agenda in Iraq, which I argue is opening Iraq, continuing to open Iraq to U.S. corporate invasion. Currently, 150 U.S. corporations have received $50 billion worth of contracts, as you said in the introduction, to utterly fail in reconstruction in Iraq, but the money has still been granted. And Mahdi is the person who advanced Paul Bremer's 100 orders in Iraq that opened up the economy. But more importantly to the Bush administration, he is the person who has most aggressively pushed their agenda for a new oil law in Iraq, which would open up Iraq's oil sector, the vast majority of Iraq's oil sector, to private foreign corporate investment.
You talk about the Bremer orders. You spend a lot of time in the book on them. Can you talk about Paul Bremer, Bremer's blueprint by bearing point the orders themselves?
Yeah, you know, in the report that you were quoting in the beginning of the hour, which said that the reconstruction failed because of poor planning, it's a myth that there was not post-war planning done by the Bush administration. The reason why it failed was because the interests it was serving were U.S. multinationals, not reconstruction in Iraq. That plan was ready 2 months before the invasion. It was written by Bearing Point Inc., a company based in Virginia that received a $250 million contract to rewrite the entire economy of Iraq. It drafted that new economy. That new economy was put into place systematically by L. Paul Bremer, the head of the occupation government of Iraq, for 14 months, who implemented exactly 100 orders, basically all of which are still in place today. And everyone who's watching, who is familiar with the policies of the World Trade Organization, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the World Bank, the IMF, will understand the orders. They implement some of the most radical corporate globalization ideas, such as free investment rules for multinational corporations. That means corporations can enter Iraq and they essentially don't have to contribute at all to the economy of Iraq. The most harmful provision thus far has been the national treatment provision, which meant that the Iraqis could not give preference to Iraqi companies or workers in the reconstruction, and therefore U.S. companies received preference in the reconstruction. They hired workers who weren't even from Iraq in most cases, and utterly bungled the reconstruction. And the most important company, in my mind, to receive blame is the Bechtel Corporation of San Francisco. They have received $2.8 billion to rebuild water, electricity, and sewage systems, the most important systems in the life of an Iraqi. After the first Gulf War, the Iraqis rebuilt these systems in 3 months' time. It's been 3 years, and as you said, those services are still below pre-war levels.
Bearing Point, why have we never heard of this company? Where does it come from?
Bearing Point was KPMG Consulting, but had to change its name in the wake of the Arthur Andersen scandal. But Bearing Point picked up all of Arthur Andersen's old clientele and is essentially just the reborn KPMG. And Bearing Point you probably haven't heard of, though, because they work in the back room. They write things like new economic policies, but are not the people seen on the ground implementing the policies. Actually, there's a wonderful story that I tell in the book by a member of the Coalition for Provisional Authority, the U.S. occupation government in Iraq, who says, one day these people from this place called Bearing Point came up and started telling us about these economic policies that were so unrealistic. I didn't know who they were and what they were talking about. Well, what they were talking about was an economic agenda that seemed completely ridiculous for the people on the ground who were looking at, sewage flowing through the streets and Iraqis saying over and over and over again, the most important thing we need is electricity. Just give us our electricity back, and failing to do it. But this was Bearing Point, and they are still there. Their contract was renewed. They're still focusing in particular on privatization of Iraq's state-owned enterprises. That's almost the sole focus of their current contract, and that contract goes, I believe, until 2007.
You have a quote of Dr. Brahimi, who is the UN Special Advisor to Iraq. A few years ago, he said, Bremer, talking about Paul Bremer, is the dictator of Iraq. He has the money, he has the signature. Nothing happens without his agreement in this country.
Bremer became the dictator of Iraq. His orders laid out the law. Now, probably the most important thing to know is that that was completely illegal under international law. The Geneva Conventions are very specific about what an occupying power should do. It must provide basic security and services. It cannot change the laws or the political structure of the country it occupies. The Bush administration did exactly the opposite, changed all the fundamental economic and political laws and utterly failed to provide for the security and the basic needs of the Iraqi people. What you hear most often in Iraq today is people saying, please just put us back where we were before you came.
We're talking to Antonia